Welcome to another episode of Come Together. We are live, Dr. Karen Barrett. Barrett, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, well, this is going to be such a fun episode. I have been it's funny because as my podcast comes along, I find that what I'm actually interested in based on when I talk to people, what they say that I pick up on, and then I want to dive deeper into those concepts. So I was recently recording with Dr. Lisa Gable out of Lafayette University, and she's a neurologist and physiologist. And we touched on music and the brain a little bit. And
Mm,
and as soon as we started touching on that, I was like, I gotta learn more about this. And so
yeah.
here we are, and I am so excited to be in your wheelhouse right here. And tell me a little bit about the kind of research that you do, or the audience at least, and a little bit
Yeah.
about your background, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so why don't I start with my background because I think it kind of explains a lot of what I do. So I grew up in a very musical household. My dad was a well, not professional, but he was a classical guitarist, pretty serious, and we basically had music going all the time. So I started playing piano when I was 5, and I was
Mhm.
really serious about it. In my childhood, I was doing, the prep conservatory programs and competitions and all of that. And then when I got to college, I did want to do music, but my parents were like, you should probably have, a backup plan. What if you break your hand or something? I was like, okay, that's smart. So I went to Wellesley College and I double majored. I did music and I did neuroscience. And at the time, they were totally separate fields. I was just doing my music and I was doing my neuroscience, but wasn't trying to combine all of them. And then the only time I finally heard about the field of music and neuroscience was my senior year. I had to do a lab project and decided to, we had these invertebrate crayfish brains and we were looking at neurogenesis. So I said, hey, let's expose them to music. They don't have
Mhm.
ears traditionally in the same way that we do, but they can feel vibrations and organized vibrations. So we did it and we found that it did increase neurogenesis. But like I said, this was just a tiny little class paper and I kind of just didn't really think too much more about it. Um, After college, I wanted to go to really focus on my instrument because I think at Wellesley I felt very split brain, trying to keep up my neuroscience, but also practice and just not finding that there was enough time to do everything. So I went to Peabody Conservatory, and there I did my master's degrees in piano performance and musicology, and it was fabulous. I was getting to music 12 hours a day, really got to focus on
Amazing.
I got to really do my art. It felt wonderful. The only thing though is that we were always playing at night, and I'm a morning person. So this was, I was like, I don't think this lifestyle is working for me. So after that, I decided that I was like, wanted to go back to academia and I wanted to do a PhD. And that's how I found the music cognition program at Northwestern. It was music cognition and theory. So we took all the usual classes you would need to teach music at a university level. So pedagogy, theory analysis, etc. But I also was able to work in auditory neuroscience. So this was the first time I was really able to combine my interest in the brain and how the brain processes music. So
That
I
must have been
finished
so exciting.
yeah, it was so exciting. I, felt like it was such a privilege to get to do 2 things that I loved and kinda mesh them together.
And
And so I
was it considered I'm sorry to interrupt, I just got a
No.
couple quick questions, if you don't mind. Is First of all, for anyone that doesn't know, neurogenesis that you mentioned, the word that
Oh,
you mentioned earlier,
yeah,
can you
sorry
just
about
break that down quickly? It's okay, no problem.
Yeah, neurogenesis is the birth of new neurons. So neurons are our brain cells, so neurogenesis is looking at the creation of new brain cells. And
And
so
does that
that
not usually happen naturally, or does that
It
need
does.
prompt?
So nowadays, we do know that our brain is plastic. In fact, this is a whole theme of all my PhD dissertation work was looking at how the brain changes as a result of
Mhm.
experience and musical training. And all of that is known as neuroplasticity. So it's the idea that your brain changes as part of learning and development, but also because of your expertise and your experience. So neurogenesis is part of it, the birth of actual new neurons. But part of what also happens in neuroplasticity is that you form new connections between certain neurons, right? And you prune other things that are not used. So it's this idea that your brain is kind of changing in plastic because you're experiencing things. And that was the whole focus of my PhD dissertation was how are the brains of musicians different from non-musicians? How do they hear differently? How do they think differently? Because they're musical experts. And so I was always really interested. I guess that is kind of a theme is this idea of like, how does the brain remodel itself because you've done music? And I loved it, but that ivory tower in academia can be kind of isolating sometimes. You're doing things in a really abstract way. And
Mhm.
so when I finished my PhD, I really wanted to do work that was more translational, meaning like actually get to do it in the real world, see how it makes a difference on patients, people living with things. So I then did a postdoc. A postdoctoral fellowship is basically a period after your PhD where you're training in new skills. And that's when I came to UCSF. I was working with Dr. Charles Lim. He was the head of the Music and Sound Perception Lab at UCSF. And
Mhm.
so when I started working with him, during my PhD, I had really focused on these like small perceptual experiments, and I was learning EEG, which is when you wear the scalp
Yeah,
electrodes
sure.
on your head, right? And you're measuring all the brain waves from your brain. But when I got to UCSF, I said, okay, I knew how to EEG, but my new skill that I was learning was fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is this idea that you use a giant scanner and you can see which parts of the brain are active or deactivated while you're doing particular tasks.
Right.
So that was something because I was working in Charles's lab, I basically started having new research areas. One was the neuroscience of improvisation, and that's because Charles himself he's a cochlear implant surgeon, but also a very experienced jazz saxophonist. So he
So
was
cool.
already studying improv, and I wanted to study improv with him. And then another research area that I started during my postdoc was music perception in cochlear implant users. So, as I said, Charles is a cochlear implant surgeon. So, these are devices that get inserted into let's say you're deaf, and your cochlea is not functioning, which is your hearing organ. You
Yeah.
put this cochlear implant air in, and now you can hear. Now, maybe it's very much maximized for speech, like that's what the cochlear implants are really good at restoring, which is already amazing if you go from being deaf to suddenly being able to hear people talk to you.
Sure.
But where cochlear implants are not as good yet is really complex sound. So think music or think noisy restaurants or things that are just emotion. Emotion is a very rich kind of acoustic signal.
Yeah.
So we study music perception in cochlear implant users. So those are two of my research areas. Neuroscience of improv, music perception in cochlear implant users. And then after I finished my postdoc, I became a faculty member here at UCSF. I am an assistant professor now, and I
Mhm.
have a joint appointment. So I'm in the Institute for Health and Aging, which is a research unit within the School of Nursing. And then also still in the Department of Otolaryngology with Charles Lim. And so the one recent new area that I've been adding to my research area is studying the use of music for health and well-being. So
Yeah.
that's what I study now too, is I've added looking at music and health. So I guess widely you could say that, my research falls in these three pots: the neuroscience of creativity and improv, music
Mhm.
perception and cochlear implant users and hard of hearing individuals, and then music for health and aging. So it's been kind of a long journey, but it kind of makes sense, I guess, given
They
my
all do.
background, you know?
They all it feels as you're explaining it, it feels all very intuitive, and,
Yeah.
what I noticed also, similarly again with, Dr. Gable, was that she mentioned, we she and I mentioned, we're talking about the fact that she didn't quite know where her research initially was gonna lead her, and
Mhm.
she said there was something really beautiful about not searching for having an end goal in mind and then trying to get there, but
Yeah.
starting with what you're excited and passionate about, and then
Yeah.
seeing where your nose and your senses and your intuition takes you.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely what happened to me. I get contacted by a lot of people who want to do careers in music and science or blending the arts and humanities with the sciences. And they're like, did you know your career was going to be like this? I'm like, no, not at all. Like on paper, it looks
Mhm.
very neat. Like I lined everything up. But the reality was every day I was just saying, well, what do I enjoy doing?
Yeah.
And it's like I found the stuff that I love doing. I mean, part of why I was drawn to doing music and the brain research is that I was spending my weekends reading these books by Oliver
Hey, everyone, real quick, if you're enjoying the show, click subscribe and rate the show 5 stars. Helps a ton. Thanks so much.
Sachs, Musicophilia, or This Is Your Brain on Music, or any of the and
Mhm.
so I was like, "Well, if I'm doing this for my fun anyways, why don't I study it?" And so I think I've always just been someone who, I don't really know where my research career will be. I think I'm still trying to figure that out, but, it's fun. It's fun as long as, like, I always have this unifying love of music and how it affects our health and our brain, so
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's super, super important, and Again, I think that there's a real value in being I talk about this in different contexts, but there's a real value, in my opinion, in play, and this actually
Yeah,
probably goes directly in with your theme,
yeah,
with play and experimentation to see where we go,
yeah.
and it feels to me and part of the reason why I'm actually why I don't typically fit into any kind of formal box, and I have a little bit of a pushback towards typical, academia or anything like or even any kind of typical bureaucracy or corporatocracy, anything like that. I have a very hard time with, but I just like to kind of sense out and sniff out where I'm going. I have no problem with the work. I just like to have that kind of plain spirit of adventure while I go along.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely, and as
yeah.
a creativity researcher, I fully support that. I think play is way more important than we realize. I mean, we play with our kids all the time, but adults really need play too, and I think play is a huge component of being creative, so I think it's great.
Yeah, and this is actually gonna take I wanna wait, we you can actually choose which kind of path we're gonna go down. I was gonna
Mhm,
ask you based on, your work with Dr. Charles, about improv versus classical playing, because you mentioned that
mhm,
your father and your background
mhm,
and your music that you played was classical, and from my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, classical music tends to be very structured,
mhm.
I believe, and then obviously jazz music and improvisational music,
Yeah.
uh, like the ones that are so active in San Francisco historically, especially, has really focused a lot more on being unstructured. So we
Yeah,
can yeah, so we
I
can
think
either kind of discuss that, or I
mhm.
was actually gonna ask you about the difference between the cochlear implants and and processing music as opposed to speech and why that would be. Which
Let's go
path you wanna go
maybe
to?
let's go to the fMRI one because I think that
Yeah.
cover that links really well with our idea of play. And so, yeah, so this idea, you're right. I think classical music, at least the way we learn it now in conservatory. So when you go to music school, it is very structured and hierarchical. It's creative in that you are trying to play really expressively, but it's
Mhm.
still within constraints, right? Like Beethoven wrote the score, you have the notes, you are supposed to interpret it, but it's creativity within its constraints. And I think that's really different from jazz, for example, and improv, because then you're doing something we call generative creativity, right? You're have just pulling new notes out. This hasn't been pre-written. You write it, you're trying to spin something on the spot. And I think something that really fascinated me about improv when I first started researching it as a postdoc was that I'm not very good at improv. So, in the past, actually in classical music, there used to be a ton of improv. So, back in the time of Mozart, he would have improvised an entire cadenza every time he had a concerto. He would have taken material from the concerto he had written and then just spring something together that's like 2 to 3 minutes. Or, if you're a vocalist, you just suddenly make up all the trills and the
Right.
ornamentations. There used to be a ton of improv. But I will say our way of learning music now, classical music now, is very structured. And so I find for me, I'm not very good at it. And I think I was really fascinated because to me, improv always looked like this really magical thing. Like, how are they pulling those notes out of thin air? And how did they not make mistakes? And I think that's what fascinated me about it in the first place. And so to study, creativity in the fMRI scanner, right? So there's what we do as artists, but then we have to think about how to make this rigorous as scientists, right?
Mhm.
So in one of Charles's original studies, this is the Lim and Braun 2008 plus one paper. Basically, he created a paradigm where you were either going to play a control. So the control was he wrote this 12-bar blues piece. He called it magnetism. And so he either had jazz experts play that piece that he had written, they memorized it and played it before they went into the scanner, or for the experimental condition, they improvised on it. So they still use that 12-bar blues architecture, but now they could do whatever they want with it. They had to keep the same tempo, the same general framework, but they could improvise. So if you think about it, the control condition is kind of like what I as a classical musician would do, right? Play a
Mm.
piece from memory, interpret it the way I want. But we're contrasting it against an experimental condition where they're generating new material. So really, then the difference between these two conditions is what happens in the brain when you are generating new musical material, right, from scratch.
Yeah.
So what you do as an fMRI, when you're doing these fMRI studies is you put your jazz musician in the scanner, and you can imagine a scanner is like basically a big magnet, like a tube. So
Mhm.
what they had to do is they created this special keyboard. It's a non-ferromagnetic custom-made keyboard that's safe to go into the scanner. And then basically all the musicians lie down and they hold the keyboard on their lap. And then as they go in the scanner, we have what we call it the face quit, but it's the Darth Vader mask basically. And there's a little mirror on it and they can see their hands.
Mhm.
So while they're in the scanner, they have to stay really, really still so you get a good picture of the brain, but they can just use their hands. So they're playing with their right hand. They're either playing that 12 bar blues when prompted, or they're improvising on that 12 bar blues. And what Charles's original study found is that if you take isolate what activity is specific to improvisation, it's really interesting. There's like a distinct both neural activation and deactivation in the brain that's associated with improv. So
Mhm.
essentially, what they find is when you look at the structures in the brain, we see an activation of the medial prefrontal cortex, which is kind of here in the front of the head. And that's an area that's usually very goal oriented and task oriented. That part gets activated, which makes sense. You're trying to like do something, right?
Mhm.
In the scanner. But at the same time, we also saw deactivation of a part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex deactivates when you're trying to, turn off the judgment area of your brain, when you're trying to just get in flow states, when you're kind of so it's like improv is this kind of goal-oriented task, but with this defocused kind of form of attention, right? And so because we had this very distinct pattern, right? Activation of the medial prefrontal cortex and deactivation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, Charles said not only are these the neural substrates of improvisation, but also maybe about flow, right? Because when an artist is in the zone, especially a really experienced jazz musician, improvising on something simple like a 12 bar blues, they're hitting flow. And so
Mhm.
that was one of his first groundbreaking papers. And ever since then, his lab and by extension me, because I work with him, I've been with him since I was a postdoc and now as a faculty member. Now we've continued to study the neural correlates of improvisation. So we looked at, okay, those were jazz experts, but what happens if we do have kids who don't play piano? What happens when they're
Mhm.
being creative? Or what happens to older adults when they do it? Or what about, in you're improvising in different artistic domains? Does music
Sure.
look different from comedic improvisers versus like an artist who's trying to generate something, right? So
Wow.
that's what our lab studies.
Wow. So you actually go beyond the realm of just music, and you actually look at the flow and improv and everything.
We're trying to at least. Certainly the field that studies the neuroscience of generative creativity or improv, we know the most in the music domain. And I think that's because music kind of lends itself easily to the scanner, right? You can like put a little instrument in.
Mhm.
Music has these discrete parameters that you can isolate, whether it's rhythm or tempo or so people have studied music a lot. But I think what our lab is recently doing, Charles and I have had funding from the National Endowment for the Arts to fund our research lab for the last 10 years. And our big project is like, okay, that's great, but what are the neural and cognitive correlates of doing improv in different art forms? So we're still studying musicians, but we're studying them as case studies. So we're like, okay, most of our data in science is about averaging a bunch of brains together and seeing what's common. But you don't go to a concert hoping for like an average concert, right? The
Right.
people like Esperanza Spalding or Hiromi or these great musicians are unique in their voices and likely in their brains too. So we're studying a bunch of these musicians as case studies,
Right.
meaning we look at each musician as their own artistic outlier and we like create things that are very much tailored to them and seeing what's really unique about their brain. But then at the same time, we're also being, okay, well, can we design some improv tasks that in the scanner that look at comedic improvisation? So think
Yeah.
professional improvisers from SNL or Second City, which was the training school for SNL. So we worked with Second City in Chicago, So we're like, what happens in amazing, amazing improvisers like Tina Fey or, these people who are just generating stuff on the spot? And then also we're looking at visual artists. Visual artists don't improv per se, but like if you think about it, they do sketch and just create things generatively. And so we're looking at, well, how is that different versus copying them? Like if you give you like, a still life, and they're just copying what they see versus trying to be creative. So that in general has been our large 10-year project for the last, like I said, for the last decade, we've been working on trying to understand different domains, not just music.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. What I would imagine and the way that I kind of while you're explaining all this, the way that I kind of imagine this is you have almost a playground is the way I look
Mhm.
at it,
Yeah,
and then you can choose to either play a game and have organized structure, or you can kinda say, "Hey, run around and figure something out and allow the emergent activities within this playground happen." Now,
yeah,
there are generally rules within the playground, like you can't beat
mhm.
kids up, you can't,
Yeah,
you can't take kids lunch or whatever it is,
yeah, yeah.
and there are rules that you gotta stick to, but that doesn't by any means restrict your creative abilities.
Absolutely, yeah,
Um
absolutely. I think that's the hardest thing. For the longest time, no one wanted to study artistic creativity in the scanner until Charles started doing it because, well, on some level, it's hard, right? Scientists are trying to use rigor and reproducibility, and it just feels like, well, that's not what creativity is like. But I think one of the beauties of the way Charles designed his experiment is that, yeah, you're right. You get to be creative. There's still constraints, but you can still be creative. And you also make a good point, too, which is that something we've started looking at is improvisation paradigms with different degrees of constraints. So if we
Right.
give you a very, let's just take the comedic improvisers, we could have you have a very constrained improv task where all you're saying is like words versus like
Mhm.
completely doing a monologue or a soliloquy, right? So it's like that's a spectrum of creativity, right? And so with our comedians, we created several paradigms to kind of look at, well, what is it like to go from something that's narrowly creative versus really creative, right? And so, yeah, it's taken a lot of creativity, honestly, from Charles and I to come up with these paradigms. But that's partially why I love it, because I think both of us are artists and musicians and scientists. He's a surgeon, I'm a PhD, but so we're polymaths and we like both parts, using both parts of these sides of ourselves. And so I love having to use creativity and be like, okay, I can make this rigorous for science, but I can still study the arts and creativity, right? In a way
Yeah.
that's like gonna make a difference. So
Can I ask, just out of curiosity, what your definition of creativity is?
yeah, so when I say creativity, at least in the context of my work, I basically mean improvisation. And I specifically mean improv as a form of like generative creativity. So meaning that you generate material on the spot spontaneously without having mapped it out, which as we said is kind of like a different creativity than like playing classical music, where you
Sure.
again have constraints, you know exactly what you're going to play, but you get to play with the tempo or the expression or things like that. So when I say creativity, I mean artistic creativity, I mean improvisation, I mean generative creativity.
Cool, cool, yeah, because the way that I always thought of it and the way that I like to think of it is kind of a and but again, you mentioned this sort of towards the beginning of the interview already, but, uh it's a lot to do with our associations, and
Mhm,
because all of us have our own very subjective experiences, what makes our creativity so much fun
mhm,
is that there's no 2 people with the same experiences, no 2
mhm,
people with the same genetics, and so what they w the w if I asked you, "What do you associate with BB King?"
mhm.
You and I will have very different
Very different
answers because
answers.
my
Yeah.
only association with him might be this duets album that he has, and I'm associating him with other artists, and you could associate him as a blues,
Mhm.
performer by himself, and what you get are totally different universes, even though we're talking about the same subject.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the beauty of the arts, right? That it is very, we talk about music and music exists in a culture, right?
Mhm,
exists in a context. So that's me wearing my historical musicology hat. That music has a
mhm,
context and culture, and no artist creates in a vacuum. They were influenced by so many different things. And so it's interesting trying to blend these things. In musicology and in the arts, we understand that arts have a context. But at the same time, I think sometimes our science is all about trying to find what is common to a bunch of things, what is replicable, rigorous. And so I think we found a good way to navigate both, right? We do the group science, what we call cohort studies, when you take a
mhm.
bunch of people and you average all the results together. We do that because that is what we need for science, right? Rigor, reproducibility. But then we're also doing these case series because, as Charles and I talked about, and like as an artist, you would never say like Renee Fleming is the same as Coltrane, right? Like we're all artists. They're all equally talented, but they do really different things. So why would you average them together, right? And so that's why we do these case studies because I'm like, and Esperanza Spalding is different from Hiromi. They're both top of their game in jazz right now, but their brains probably have these unique things that make them them, as well as like, when they create, you have their unique voice, right? Everyone brings their experiences to their performance. So this is why we advocated for using a case study approach too. Now, of course, the hard part about it from a science perspective, they're like, well, if it's only an n equals one, right? If you only
Mhm.
have one case study, you can't generalize to the rest of the people, right? Like Esperanza Spalding isn't like the rest. I'm like, understandable, and that is a fair critique, of course. We can't generalize Esperanza's brain to somebody else's, but maybe there's something we can learn. Like the more of these case
Sure.
studies we do, maybe there is
Patterns.
something we can. There's maybe patterns that come out, or there's things that we learn just from looking at somebody's unique brain, right? It's just like, yeah, when people studied Beethoven's brain, I'm pretty sure they analyzed Beethoven's brain, Einstein's brain, all these greats throughout history. There probably are things that make them very unique, and then there's probably things that are pretty common to high achieving scientists, artists, etc. too. So I think it's we're always mirroring both. And to be fair, the whole field of of neuroscience of creativity is relatively young. I mean,
Yeah.
Dr. Lim Charles says that when he started this, there was not a lot of people doing it, and now we have an entire academic society, the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity, that does work in this field. So it's changed a lot, just even in like 25 years.
And
So
it's really exciting. It's really exciting
yeah.
because we could see that there are benefits, and
Mhm.
I wanna talk to you about some of them, and one of the benefits potentially, and again with creativity, and this is an observation that I've had, and I wonder what you think about it. I've noticed that a lot of the great improvisers, or the oh my gosh, improvisational players or
Uh-huh.
bands all tend to be extremely steeped in a lot of different types of musical backgrounds.
Yep.
And so whether you're talking about the Allman Brothers or you're talking about the Grateful Dead, or you're
Yeah.
talking about Billy Strings,
Yep.
or you're talking about even Ella Fitzgerald, and again,
Mhm.
I think I talked to you about, in, Doctor Dan Levitan's book about, her scatting, I believe, or maybe I don't remember if I talked to you about that, but you
Mm.
know, that there's something about the like what you said, the vocals, the words, as opposed to
Mhm.
just playing, where you can
Mhm.
kind of riff based on your
Mhm.
experiences. It almost seems that in order to be able to be a great improviser, you gotta be able to have a big pool of data to draw from.
Yes, and in fact, that's actually here. I'm gonna pause 1 second because I
Please,
hear my
yes.
husband starting to play cello, so
Sure, no
I'm
problem.
gonna just
There you go.
yeah, thank you. So, yeah, to your point about that, a lot of the great improvisers have a lot of knowledge of different genres, or if you, I think that's absolutely true. So, there have been theorists who have put forth these frameworks for improvisation, and for example, Pressing. Pressing is someone who theorized like how do people improvise? Like what is the process? And what he basically says, and I'm summarizing, is basically that if you're a really experienced improviser, you have all these licks and schemas in your head, right? You've played all the scales, you know the scheme, you know the licks, you know what to do. And so then when you get very good at it and you've practiced all of those that knowledge and it's at your fingertips or your mouth or
Mhm.
whatever it is, then when you sit down to just create, you're not playing for nothing. You're just concatenating and bringing things together in really unique ways on the spot. But it's not that you're actually pulling from thin air. You're actually pulling from a lot of knowledge.
Sure.
So, and that's something like, for example, Zakir Hussein, who's the greatest tabla master that ever lived. He just passed away in December. But one of the things that was really great about him is not only is he fantastic at tabla, which is Hindustani classical percussion improvisation, but he was genre bending, right? He would work
Right.
with jazz musicians and I love that. I love artists who really kind of go outside their normal routine and can work with all sorts of different artists and create something really new. I know Yo-Yo Ma, as a classical musician, does that too, right? So I think this is why we love the idea of looking at each artist. Each artist has their own unique way of things and
Mhm.
recombining things. And I think this is where the case study approach has a lot of benefit, even if it means we can't generalize to the whole population.
Definitely, 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 and I also wonder if you were to tell someone, "Hey, if you want a healthier brain or a little bit more of a if you want to experience some more generation or more
Mhm.
neuroplasticity,
Yeah.
would exposing themselves to more and different types of either music or just in general, different types of information be a necessary, requirement in order to do so?"
Yeah, absolutely. So that was definitely the focus of my PhD is like I would say as a researcher that if you want to increase neuroplasticity, right, you should learn new skills, do things
Yeah.
that are complex and multimodal. So when I say that, the reason music is very powerful as a tool for neurogenesis, for neuroplasticity, is because music involves so many different activities and processes and domains, right? There's pattern recognition and emotional processing and sound matching and moving your body and moving your fingers and matching to space and your memory. And so, because of that, I often say that that's why music is biologically powerful. So, let's say you were, and a lot of the research shows if you play music, if you try it as a new skill, it does do great things for the brain. And this is particularly important because if you think about it from the opposite spectrum, by the time we get old, right, when we're older, there are neurodegenerative disorders, right? There's
Mhm.
Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. That's from the death of neurons, right? So if you can do things like music, which almost will serve as a prophylactic kind of thing where you're increasing neurogenesis, right? That helps combat this kind of cognitive decline that's going to happen with age for all of us. So for a long time, have always told everyone, do music, like even listening to music is good, listening to new things is good, but actually doing it too, like that procedural memory of trying to do something is really important. And if you're not into music, there are other things you can do, right? That's why people recommend things like learning new languages or crossword
Mhm.
puzzles or learning a new art form, right? But I do think music is, as a researcher who studies music, I think music is particularly powerful because it is so multimodal. It draws from sound and pattern recognition, emotion, and everything, language, and so
Yeah,
it's very powerful when packaged together.
I love that. I really do. Okay, I wanna talk about perception a little bit. I'm really
Yeah.
excited about perception because, and I have a cou I guess I have, maybe one example that I've given before in the podcast, but I for many years, I was a Bruce Springsteen nut.
Like
I
many of
found
us.
I think yeah, many of us, and I found really, really, really that he had, as far as I'm concerned, saved my life in
Mhm,
emotional ways throughout the years, and the biggest risks and the times that I've really had to step up to the plate most of my life,
mhm.
I was helped along by his lyrics and his music, and then I tried showing this to my high school students, uh, and I found that they weren't as crazy about it as I was. And I, um so I tried an experiment, my own self-experiment as a high
Uh-huh,
school teacher where I played, the song Badlands for them, the Springsteen
uh-huh.
song Badlands, every day for 4 days.
Ah,
It's a school week,
yeah.
and I asked them to point out what they noticed about the song the first
Uh-huh,
day, and then the second day, the third day, and the fourth day,
uh-huh.
and as music became more familiar to their ear, and as they began to and as the song wasn't so strange because they're not
Heard it.
hearing this new rock tone, rhythm, whatever it is,
Yeah.
for the first time, they started to notice drum fills and guitar
Mhm,
riffs and
uh-huh,
specific lyrics that jump out at them.
uh-huh,
And the way that I like to say the way that the metaphor that I walked away from with is almost like when you meet someone for the first time, you judge them initially based on
mhm,
the most external aspects of them.
mhm,
And then
mhm,
as you get to talk to them, "Oh, you like music too? I like music too.
mhm,
You like
mhm,
psychology? I like psychology. You have a family?
mhm,
I have a family." All of a sudden, even though I would have I would have judged one way, as I got to know you a little bit more, my perception evolves and and I'm able to notice more nuance.
mhm.
And I feel like that's the way that we actually go ahead about processing things like music as well. Can
Absolutely.
you speak to that,
Absolutely.
please? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wish I could remember exactly who the author of this paper is, but there was a I think one music theorist or musicologist who talked about, if you're reading a detective story, you get
Mhm.
something on the first reading, then the second reading, and the third reading, right? So if you're
Sure.
reading a detective story, right? The first reading, you're just like, okay, I want to know who did it. Like, okay, does this all make sense, right? But then you can still go back and read a mystery novel again because then we're like, oh, were there clues all along? Like, should I have seen something? And then 3, oh, I picked up on these details that I didn't notice the first time, right? Which is kind of like analogous to your saying that, like, when we see each other, there's only the surface things before you get to deeper meaning and deep in common ground. So someone I'll have to find the paper for you later, but someone also said it's analogous to music listenings where you have a first hearing, a second hearing, and a third hearing. So maybe on the first hearing, you're just getting very surface things, like how long is the piece, what's the general feel, things like that. But by second hearing, you're starting to know where is it going, what are the details, what do the lyrics really mean, and things like that.
Mhm.
And then by the third hearing, you're getting all those smaller details, like where is their silence, where are their drum fills, where does it like pick up, and if the chorus sounds really different, right? And I think with any what beautiful art, whether that's writing, music, whatever, you gain a lot from multiple hearings. And I think, or multiple listenings, hearings,
Mhm.
readings, etc. I think definitely with music and that's something I think is very hard for a lot of people new to classical music. It has a complexity, like, the first time you hear it, you're not gonna grab everything. There's too many chords, it goes so it's a half-hour piece, how can you take that all in the first time? You can't, right? But if you keep with it and you keep listening to it, you will start discovering new things, and there is cognitive science work that shows that familiarity increases liking. The more familiar you are with something, the more you like it. Now there is at the same time, that's with a caveat. So there was this person who designed something called the Berline curve. And they said, really, where you have your peak interest in something is when it's optimum complexity. So if it's too simple, you don't like it because it's boring. If it's too hard, you can't understand it, right? The optimum place where you're really starting to get it is when it's like the medium, the optimum
Mm.
complexity. And I think I tie that a lot to these listenings too, right? At the first time, it's too hard to understand everything. And then if it were too simple, you would just get bored eventually. But like good music or good art is worth a second try where you really are starting to bring in all those complexities. So basically, that phenomenon that you notice with your high school students is pretty much backed up by cognitive science as well.
There we go.
Yeah.
I'm so I'm happy to hear that. I'm
He's
happy
like,
to
"I'm
hear that I'm not just making that up.
right."
That's so great, that's so great. Well, yeah, and I noticed that too, by the way, because I was listening to a Billy Strings song yesterday while I was jogging, and
Mhm,
obviously, one of the benefits of listening to some great live performers as opposed to studio variations is that, they tend to be a little, especially if you're a
mhm.
"fun jammer," quote, unquote,
Yeah,
then you don't then even though you might recognize the bare bones of the song or the
yeah,
structure of the song, there's something fun about the newness and the
yeah,
novelty to the jam.
yeah.
And I'm listening to a song, and it's called, "While I'm Waiting Here," and and I was thinking, I was thinking while I'm jogging, I'm like, "I love this song." There's
Mhm.
something about this song that
It
really
just
hits, and I
hits.
realized
Yeah.
it kinda sounds like a lot of songs that I know, but
Mhm,
it's just being done really,
mhm.
really, like, well with a cool flair that I like,
Yep.
and I was like, "Oh, maybe that's why that's why it's hitting particularly well for me."
Yeah.
Whereas if there's a song whose title I don't recognize and source I don't recognize, and if the name sounds a little weird for what I would imagine a song title to be called, I'm far, far more hesitant, even if I love the artist and even if I already know that I
Mhm.
like the artist, I'm
Yeah.
hesitant to jump into it, and
Yeah.
I don't one of the bigger struggles that I have actually, even though I like to be open-minded, is that I am very quick to judge books by their covers, and
Well,
it's really hard for me to get over.
I mean, that's also pretty normal, right? So there has been work in music cognition about music preferences, right? And music preferences are not only shaped by biological things like your temperament, your your natural temperament for things, but also by like, your culture and your experience, your lived experience and things like that, right? And something that we often talk about too is how do we define creativity, right? A lot of the really creative things that we deem creative are not so completely novel that you can't even recognize them, right? Like,
Mhm.
I think there's this idea that creative things are things that are useful and novel and, like, recombine familiar elements. I mean, I always think about this, like, when Harry Potter came on the scene, I think it's hugely creative back from when we were young, right, in the '90s and stuff,
Yeah.
but it does use tropes, right? Like, Harry
Uh-huh.
Potter uses, the boarding school, the British boarding school, magic, things, but the way that she recombined them was so
Right.
unique for the time, right? And so, a lot of what we think is creative is also sometimes just about recombining them in a really cool juxtaposition that we hadn't seen. I mean, that I think goes back to what we are saying with jazz and improv, right? They're not pulling it from out of thin air, even though it seems
Right.
so
It's still a
magical, right?
playground.
Yeah, there's still a playground. There's still some structure. They're still playing schemas and licks and things like that. Like if you were gonna take I like so one of the things I love is Coltrane's my favorite things from
Mhm.
Sound of Music. Well, you start with the lick, right? My favorite things, and then he improvises on it. But like if he improvised so far that it broke down and you couldn't even hear that was my favorite things anymore, it's probably not as enjoyable, right? The reason
Yeah.
it's enjoyable is it has that familiarity. Like it still
Yeah.
sounds like my favorite things, but done so well, you know? So I think that's completely normal, like your experience. Not only is there interaction with, like I said, your biological and your psychological temperament, but then there's also this idea that like it's familiar enough, but novel enough
Yeah,
that it's
that's
both
right.
creative and
I have to check
interesting.
that out. I have to
Yeah.
check that out. One of my favorite examples of that is, Duke Ellington's Nutcracker.
Yeah.
Oh my god, it's
It's
so much fun,
gorgeous. It's
and it's
so
so cool.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
And then you're
and what
like and you're
I
always like,
do
yeah.
Go
What
ahead,
would
please.
Tchaikovsky think? But he'd probably love it.
Yeah, totally, and what I've done is and what I like to do is I do creative writing assignments in my class where I'll
Yeah.
just play, all m you know, instrumental music, and I have the class write what
Mhm.
pops into their mind, what
Mhm.
associations and imagery pops into their mind,
Right.
and what's fun is to do comparative, I'll play the Nutcracker, and then I'll play Duke Ellington's The
Yeah.
Nutcracker, and just see, like, does this take you to the same place? Where does this
Yeah.
take you to? And how
Yeah.
and how does it differ? What
Yeah.
aspects of music causes the change? And I try to actually get
Yeah.
them to identify, is it the fact that it's a brass section that
Mhm.
changes things? Is it the fact that it's a horn section that
Yeah.
creates a new world in your head as opposed to
Yeah.
just a soft piano?
Yep.
So it's really cool. The cochlear implants
Yes.
and the
Yes.
trouble in perception with music as opposed to
Yeah.
speech.
Yeah,
Can
let's
we
talk
speak into
about
that?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you think about speech versus music, music is actually one of the richest acoustic stimuli we ever hear as humans. So, what I mean by that is music goes through a much wider pitch range than
Mhm,
speech. Speech is in a much more narrow. We also have wider dynamics, right? Like much more soft and loud. We have a lot more different timbres. In speech we have female, male voices, and there's different timbres. But then think about how many instruments there are, right?
mhm,
And so it's basically music is much more acoustically rich than speech if you just look at them as stimuli. And for that reason, cochlear implants are amazing devices, right? In that they help people now hear again. But what happens is the cochlear implant has like 12 electrodes in this little implant device that's supposed to stimulate the thousands of hair cells that you would normally have, right? If in the human ear. And there's no way 12 to 24 electrodes could simulate, like, be as pristine as thousands and thousands of hair cells. And so that's why there's a technological limitation for why cochlear implants can't pick up all the richness of things like music and speech. And so, really, right now, what the research field is trying to figure out is okay, well, what does music sound like to a cochlear implant user? And,
right?
it really varies. For kids who get cochlear implants, let's say you had a deaf child and they get implanted early, they adapt very well. Again, not surprisingly, because they have very plastic brains, right? They're developing, so the brain's already undergoing a lot of structure. It's not hard to get used to, to remodel itself and get used to listening to a cochlear implant. But let's say you're an older person getting a cochlear implant. Well, it is going to be harder to train your brain to hear now with this device instead of, your ears. And so we are trying to look at how do cochlear implant users hear music? And how is that different from something like a hearing aid? So the
Yeah,
cochlear implant actually replaces all those thousands of hair cells in your cochlea, right? A hearing aid is different. It just amplifies. It's like an acoustic signal, just amplifies what you might not hear very well. And then that's really different from someone who's deaf. So I've learned recently that how the deaf experience music is also very unique. So people are like, well, deaf individuals can't hear music. Maybe they don't hear music, they don't perceive music the way you and I would, but they definitely hear music. And the reason they would do it is they can feel the vibrations. For example, I've seen a lot of deaf individuals hold like balloons or things like that on the, and they can feel the vibrations, particularly if you go to a show like Stomp or, taiko drumming, something that has really good
yeah.
rhythm, they can feel that. But I've also learned from my colleague Annabelle Monahan that the deaf community, will sign music. And what they do is they sign the music very differently for music versus something like poetry or language, like their expression in using sign language. So, really, this idea of music in the heart of hearing is really fascinating because it's not that they don't hear music, they don't hear it the way we do, basically.
Cool. That's amazing. I while you were speaking, I was curious, um, when you were describing the issue with the cochlear implant, that the fact that, it's using 12 electrodes, you said?
Yeah, 12 to 24 electrodes that are trying to replace the
Yeah.
thousands of hair cells that you would normally have.
But kids seem to be able to adapt faster. Would that indicate that there's more than just the cochlear,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
there's more
Yep.
to, the way that we perceive music than
Yeah.
just that. It's also about our brain's ability to translate that, and so if you're a kid, you might be more likely to be able to do more with less, and
Yep.
when you're adult or getting older, your
Yep.
brain already has learned at that point to not use that part of your brain, that
Yeah.
part of your body?
Yeah, think about it this way, so if you think about hearing as a peripheral thing, so it's not just that the cochlear implant gives a signal. Your
Mm.
brain, your cortex has to interpret these signals, right? And
Right.
in many ways, a lot of kids will often be very happy with their cochlear implants, have high device satisfaction because they don't really have anything to compare it to, right? If they never heard music, quote unquote, normally, music
Yeah.
still sounds great in a
Yeah.
cochlear implant, right? But then pretend you are an adult and you were a musician, for example, and then you lost your hearing because you suddenly had an illness or something and you have to get a cochlear implant. Well, then you have all this lived experience too, right? You're
Yes.
trying to
Yes.
compare what music sounds like now with your cochlear implant versus what it used to sound like, right? And that's like any sort of prosthetic device. If you were used to having your arms and your legs and now you have to adjust to a device, you're going to be comparing it to what it used to feel like, right? And so
So is
that's
musical
also part of it.
expression different among those kids? Do they
Yeah,
learn a
so
type
what
of
we'd
music?
find is that the kids a lot of the research shows that kids, have better music perception than adult cochlear implant users. So, like, not only are they better able to hear music with their devices, but you can train them too. So let's say I use musical training as, like, a targeted, like, intervention to see if I can increase your music like, "Okay, you're bad at hearing melody, let me give you lots of melodies to listen to, and then test and see how you do." Kids do way better. They would have much bigger experiment like effects of learning from these music interventions compared to adults. And so we do think there is this kind of plasticity, just like how kids can learn languages very easily when they're young.
Mhm.
This is like critical period for us to learn language. Well, and it's harder when you're an adult. Not that you can't learn a new language, but it's a lot more effort, that sort of thing. That's kind of the same thing that we're seeing. Kids can just adapt so easily compared to those of us who would have to adapt later and work harder for the same results.
That's so interesting. It's really cool. So if I'm understanding correctly, um, adults seem to struggle. There are
Mhm,
people, people that have already had associations
mhm,
and memories and
mhm.
expectations
Yeah,
have a harder time, uh, using the cochlear implants because they already have a perception of what things should be, and the
yep,
implant and the implants are not creating that.
right,
And
yeah,
youth don't have such an issue,
yep.
and so they are not as dependent on it sounds like the implants are more of a bridge than they are, actual means to actually
Well,
hear a process or
yeah, and
think.
I feel like we haven't, Charles and I have talked about this. Like, if we had to lose any sense, hearing,
Yeah,
sight,
yeah.
whatever, I mean, even though I'm a musician, I would still want to lose hearing simply because we've gotten the farthest in terms of perfect sensory restoration, right?
Mhm.
So the cochlear implants are remarkable devices. They really like change your life in terms of being able to not hear and then suddenly you can hear. But where we are is it's not perfect yet, right? And
Yeah.
so there are things you can do, right? So there are technological limitations, but cochlear implant manufacturers are constantly playing with, well, can we change the programming? How do we update the processor? Can we do other things that will improve it? And then there's researchers like me who are like, well, if we put you through training, can we change things? But then there's also what we call other determinants of health. So, something that my lab now studies with Dr. Nicole Jim, she and I run a lab together in otolaryngology, is we're looking specifically at this early auditory rehabilitation period. So, what are you like right before you go in for your surgery and you get your implant versus 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, right? And there's actually a lot of variability. So, some people, let's just say even adults, some people do great with their device. They're like, they work very hard. They go to every single follow-up appointment. They spend time listening to sound, watching subtitles, really working and trying to get used to their cochlear implant. But then there's others who don't do as well. Maybe this could be a case too. You hear it, it doesn't sound good to you, so you feel like, oh, was this worth me going through this painful surgery? Now I'm upset with this device. I don't
Mhm.
want to use it, so I take it off and I don't use it. Well, if you don't use it, you're never going to get better at it, right? So this is something that I often counsel people is like, yes, it's a huge transition to go through this surgery, but it's like music. When we sit down and play as musicians, we don't sound perfect right off the bat. We sound like beginners every time we learn a new piece. Practice makes perfect. You have to practice to get better. Same thing with your cochlear implant. You're going to have to practice using it to get better
Gotcha.
at it. So if you get frustrated right off the bat and take it off and don't use it, well, you're never going to get better, right? And so we're really starting to learn about like, how can we counsel patients to better set up expectations? And not only that, maybe we will have predictors of like maybe we'll have eventually like these kind of like how when you take your kid to the doctor and they have growth curves. So you can be like,
Mhm,
okay, your kid is on track to be 6'2" and da 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 percentile, right? Well, we don't have any sort of those kind of developmental curves for cochlear implant users. We can't say like, okay, you're on track to be a really good performer, or you're on track to you're not doing as well as you should be at this rehabilitation mark. We need to intervene and do better, right? So that's the kind of work that our lab is doing now. Like, imagine if we could have that analogous, growth curve, and we could tell patients, okay, I can see you're not doing as well as you need to right now at the 1 month mark. Let's intervene now so that you'll do better at the 3 or 6 month. And then, or someone's doing really, I'd be like, you're doing great. I think you're starting to hit the limit of what we can expect right now with the cochlear implant, right? These are all things that would help patients, especially if you think about it's a huge decision to get a cochlear implant. In fact, there's still a divide. There are, the deaf community who don't ever want to use cochlear implants and just want to remain sign language only, which is,
mhm.
totally. But then there's the people who get cochlear implants. So there's even like a culture difference between these two groups. And so our lab is trying to start navigating some of these issues.
I'd be really curious, and if you haven't done it, I would be curious to look into this, if what the difference, as far as adjusting would be to cochlear patients who have a history of playing music as opposed to
Yeah.
those who don't.
Yeah.
And
And unfortunately, there haven't been enough yet.
yeah. Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah, that's the problem
yeah,
with a
there's
small
not
pool like this,
Yeah,
right?
it's a small
Emerging
sample.
science.
Yeah, it's a small subject pool. I think the first cochlear implant was done at UCSF, and I wanna say it wasn't even that long ago, like 1950s, 60s, something like that.
Oh,
I'll have
wow.
to look it up. It hasn't been a new technology. It was
Right.
but one of the first ones was done here on the West Coast, and so far, we don't even have enough data yet.
Okay.
I realize that I meant
It's really yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean, the way that you're describing it almost sounds like you have to kind of prep your brain for
Mhm.
this, and if your brain is already plastic from playing different types of music or playing different
Yeah.
types of instruments or doing things along the way, then it might be quicker to adapt to such a
Yeah.
transition.
Yeah, and something so I've given a whole keynote to the Hearing Loss Association of America because we were giving this expert panel in 2023. It's called The Joy of Music, and it was
Mm,
for all these individuals with hearing loss. And as part of the expert panel, these people with hearing loss could come up and ask specific questions, right? So I would get questions like, I used to be in a choir, I used to be in a band before I
mhm,
got the surgery or my hearing aid, and now everything sounds awful. What should I do? And I was like, well, you kind of have to go back and practice. One thing I recommend is practice the way we would have as beginner, isolate, practice by yourself first. Don't go
mhm,
straight back to the group. That's a really complex acoustic situation. Just practice by yourself. Use tools, right? Metronomes, recording yourself, teachers, right? To help you as you adjust, you can't just expect that you will be at the top of your game right away. And, I think people think that musicians are just naturally good and naturally talented at music. No, the fact is we work really hard. Musicians spend like for me when I was a performer, I never relied on my own ears, actually.
right,
Like, because, for example, when I'm playing up at the piano, what I hear is really different from what they hear at the back of the concert hall, right? Because of reverb and acoustics. And so I always had teachers or recorders to help me. We didn't rely on
mhm,
things. And I spent a lot of time, like, with really complex pieces. No, you have to sit there spending a lot of time isolating the lyrics, isolating the sound, right hand only, left hand only, rhythm only, melody only, right? Like, we
oh,
spend a
man,
lot of time taking a complex thing and putting it together. And so, basically, at this Hearing Loss Association of America talk, I was like, okay, maybe we can learn from the kind of practice techniques that
yeah,
musicians use to get used to using our cochlear implant, And, it's not perfect, but it's like, I don't think people, just like I used to think improv was like this magical thing that just comes out of nowhere. People think when I sit down at the piano, that's this magical thing. It's not though. It's hard
yeah,
work, right? It's
yeah,
hours and hours and years of hard work. And I'm sure you've read about it, right? The old adage that 10,000 hours to become an
mhm,
expert, right? Like, it's lots of practice. It doesn't come naturally. And then even an experienced pianist like me, when I learn a new piece, I'm back to being a beginner again, right? It's like,
mhm.
all right, I have to go super slow. I'm gonna go one note at a time. I'm gonna listen to see I don't know what I'm doing. I have to start all over again, right? And I think that's actually humbling, but good to remember, right? That's just the experience of doing art. We all
Yeah,
start.
and then eventually you come to cherish that process,
Yeah,
and I know that, that I've started to in the last bunch of years, I've had a lot of firsts in my life, I had the
yeah,
first getting married, first time having a kid, first
babies,
jujitsu
yeah,
class,
yeah,
first guitar lesson, first open mic,
yeah,
and every single time I do all these first things, first podcast, I I have an enormous sense of fear, but
of course.
I've come to appreciate the process, and I've found that people are so forgiving and saying, "It's good that you're starting this from the beginning,"
Yeah,
and it's really something that's more commendable than it is that everyone expects you to be a expert at
perfect.
anything you do the first time you pick it up, and
Yeah,
so I think that that's something in general that if people in if anyone listening and people in general want to grow and want to
yeah,
advance, to embrace the starting something from the beginning and be okay with being a beginner and then
yeah.
move on, and
Uh,
get better.
Absolutely. That's something that I hear all the time, right? As someone who researches the arts and
Mhm.
music and the brain, and I very much advocate everyone should do the arts and play every day, right? And they're like, but I suck at the arts. I have no talent whatsoever. I'm like,
Yeah.
it's not about talent. It's about doing it anyway. So like
That's right.
for me, I mean, okay, I'm a musical expert, but when I sit down and like drawing, I draw like a musician. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't. It doesn't come out good. I'm back to coloring because trying to learn color theory and shading and things like that, and that's good for me, right? Like,
Mhm.
I mean, how boring would life be if we were only doing the things we're good at? I personally think it's good for ourselves and our brains to try new things that are scary, but no one it's kind of a false belief to think that you would be good at something the first time you do it, right? And I know that that's like a culture that's very like goal oriented, but if you look at the arts as a process, the process is being uncomfortable and trying new things. And it is good for your brain because, yeah, the first time I learn a new language, I'm going to struggle. But that struggle is part of why it helps my brain,
Yeah,
So the
that's right.
struggle is inherent to it. And there's the beauty of the struggle that is actually good for you? I mean, not so hard that you feel really demotivated, but I guess I would encourage anyone who's listening that it's always okay to try and make mistakes. And here's the thing too, that's something I learned from improv. As I told you, I'm a classical pianist, and so I'm not used to improvising. But every now and then, Charles would be like, "Come on, just come play with me." And I was like, "I don't like it. What if I make a mistake?" And he'd be like, "So make a mistake, and then do it again, and then do
Yeah.
it again, and then do it again, and it's no longer a mistake, right?" And that's something my husband also echoes, right? The idea of improv is to just kind of take it as it comes. There are no mistakes. You did it again, just do it again deliberately until it gives you your next idea, right? And I think that's a very beautiful philosophy, right? That there are no mistakes. You just try and you try again. And, I think, and maybe this is a nice lead in to my study with the kids, is like, if
Yes.
you watch kids who are really creative, I don't know about your kids. My kids love like, it doesn't matter that he doesn't know how to bake or be an architect or garden. He's going to do it anyways and he finds it fun, right? And we notice that kids are just kind of very creative in a way that's different from adults, right? Like, obviously, adult has lived experiences and voice and domain knowledge, right? Like, if you're at Esperanza Spalding, you've been doing music for a long time. So you obviously are drawing on that. Whereas a kid who's like, well, I'm just going to go bang on the piano, they don't have that, but they're still like willing to try and be creative, right? So in one of our studies that just came out last year in Scientific Reports, we were like, well, yeah, we really want to know what happens when kids are being musically creative, right? So we took these elementary age kids, 7 to 9 year olds,
Nice.
and we had them do this paradigm where they either played a scale for the control. So they played the five black note keys of the keyboard, just da 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 da, like very rote over and over again. Or we had them improvise melodies, like play them now in whatever order you want, and you're
Mhm.
improvising. And we
Mhm.
made it sound really cool because we gave them a backtrack that went with all it. So as long as they're playing the black note keys, they always sound good. It's like impossible to make a mistake. It then sounds really musical. There's like a whole backtrack to it. So the only difference is, play same tempo, same speed, everything, but either you're playing a scale or you're moving your fingers and making up melodies. You
Mhm.
just put those in whatever order. And what we found is that kids, improvisation is again a really cool, distinct activity for kids that you have. It doesn't look the same as when the control condition. And really, when you're improvising for them, it's a lot about deactivating parts of their brains. So kids deactivate these structures known as like the singular cortex, the angular gyrus, precuneus. And all of those structures are sensory hubs that are actually implicated in adult creativity. So it's like when we look at kids and they're being creative, they're using some of the same structures that you would later as adults. And so it's almost like you have the roots, the beginning roots of this like neuro creativity network, right? But what was also really cool is that improvising, we found that there was more connections between reward areas of the brain when they were improvising compared to now doing like the scale. Now, I will caveat that and say it wasn't all positive. So, for example, we found that the amygdala deactivates during improv. Well, that's good. The amygdala often deactivates for good things, like, when the
Mm,
fight or flight is over, we're good, right? But then
right.
we also saw that like the nucleus accumbens and some other areas deactivated, which is not necessarily a positive valence thing. So it's almost like reward structures are used for improv, but it has kind of a mixed emotional content. It's not just positive, it's positive and negative. And so I thought about that for a while. I'm like, why would there be mixed? Why isn't it just purely rewarding? Well, for one, I was sticking kids in a scanner. That's kind of an odd thing,
Yeah.
and putting kids in a scanner was probably a little scary to them. We had their parents nearby, but it's a strange thing. But then I also thought about it, I'm like, maybe it shouldn't be purely positive. I mean, music for many of us, like we listen to music that's sad, right? I often
Sure.
the music that's sad or angry or negative, right? And the idea is that music is a safe place to process all those emotions, right? So
Yeah.
maybe the whole point isn't that it should just be all positive reward. It can be positive and negative reward, right? But either way, we really liked this experience because it kind of gets to, as we were talking about, the beginner mind. Like what's happening when you're a true beginner, right? Because many of these kids had never even seen a keyboard before. I sat down and be like, okay, curve your fingers, put your hands here. Now we're going to have you do this in the scanner. And it was amazing. They weren't scared. They did it, right? So whenever someone tells me, we were kind of catching like the neurocorrelates of the beginner mind. And I don't know if you've ever heard this term, but the beginner's mind is something that comes from meditation, right? So in meditation, they are saying like, the expert is kind of solidified in their way of thinking, but in the beginner's mind, it's very open to experience. It's very
Sure.
plastic. It's very like whatever happens, happens. You're not set in your ways, right? And so I kind of think of this as like this was a beautiful illustration of the beginner minds. Kids' creativity does have that raw kind of quality to it. It's very different from adult creativity, but they're still able to be creative. And being creative like improvising is rewarding, well maybe that's why kids are so drawn to be creative, right? They don't have a lived experience, they're not comparing it to anything, so they might as well do it, right? They might
Mhm.
as well be creative, right? So that was a study that we did last year. Now, of course, there's a huge difference between like untrained kids who have never played piano and jazz experts, right? So that kind of shows you already in our field how there's a lot of like points to fill in between. But it was really cool because I think that study was, at least to my knowledge, the first like neuroimaging experiment to look at creativity. So,
It's really I wanted to just ask one question just on that whole,
mhm.
the whole idea was when you mentioned that it was not all positive,
Mhm.
responses,
Yeah.
I wanna be clear, does that mean that they didn't only feel good things, or does that mean that not only good things were happening to their brain? I'm not I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. So what I mean it's a little bit more specific than that, right? So
Okay.
whenever we talk about reward, we talk about valence, valence being positive or negative, right? So what we saw specifically is that the amygdala deactivates. And that when the amygdala deactivates, if you look at all the literature, that's associated with positive valence. That's a positive thing.
And when
But
it's
when you
activated, we tend to be, like, fearful or cautious, is that
yeah,
what
yeah, your
okay.
amygdala is really active if you're running away from a lion, for
Right.
example.
And so I think there was, remember the movie I don't know if you saw Free Solo?
I
That
don't
that
think I've ever
that
seen that
or
one.
this
No.
guy that he was on Netflix, Alex something, he climbed,
Uh-huh.
like, the high he's a
Ah,
free
oh, yeah.
solo climber,
Yeah.
and they stuck him in one of those, scanners, and they found
Yeah.
that his amygdala I don't think it was not working, but it was not working to the full capacity, and so he
Yeah.
said he had a very muted sense. He
Yeah.
had, like, a very philosophical sense of, like, "If I die, I die," but he had a very
Yep.
muted sense of this kind of internal fight or flight instinct that he said
Yeah.
same thing.
And that same kind of result has been seen with expert meditators. So there was a study, I think, of Buddhist monks. I'll have to look this up, but there was a study of monks who are expert meditators, and they
Mhm.
noticed when they meditate in the scanner, they can literally calm down their like they
Cool.
have the ability to like just kind of and the amygdala, these are like deep structures in the brain that are kind of like I said, it's kind of a primal thing when the amygdala activates because he's like you're scared, you can't but these people can with their thoughts actually bring it down. And so when I say these reward areas, so what we saw was amygdala, caudate, and nucleus accumbens. Those are all reward areas of the brain, but only
Mhm.
the amygdala deactivating is considered positive. When the caudate and the nucleus accumbens deactivate, that's actually a little bit negative. So,
So what happens then? What's the consequence of that? Like,
um,
what emotion I guess, is that an
yeah,
emotional thing, or what's the
yeah, it's
consequence?
usually an emotional thing. So, for example, the caudate deactivates when you miss a reward. So, like, let's say you were doing a
Whoa.
prediction thing and you were like trying to get a reward or a treat or something, it would deactivate. And
But that
then
makes
the
sense.
nucleus, yeah, and the nucleus accumbens, it deactivates when you're trying to avoid harm or when you just don't feel a lot musically or when you're
Uh-huh.
depressed, right? So,
Yeah.
this is what I mean is like the caudate and the nucleus accumbens deactivating is not necessarily a good thing. Only the amygdala deactivating is a positive valence. So this makes me feel like, okay, it's mixed. There's some positives, there's
Yeah.
some negative. And I was like, but that's really interesting. I mean, first off, it is a really complex task, right? You're trying to do this like cognitive motoric thing, and the scanner's really loud, and my mom's out there, and I'm trying to do
Mhm.
maybe it's just too hard. It's not natural, right? It's not like a little kid being with mommy and daddy. It's not purely positive, right? But then, like I said, I think there's this idea that music can also be a safe place to
Yeah.
experience the whole gamut of emotions, right? I don't just play music that's positive. Sometimes I watch a movie or play music that's sad on purpose. And I like that whole spectrum of complexity of
Yeah.
emotions, right? So it's not just that it has to be all positive. So that's kind of the clarification.
And also to clarify, just to build on that idea, you said that when they're improvising, it's against a backdrop of
Mhm.
music that make that makes sense, right?
Yeah, that makes them
So
sound good. Yeah.
yeah, so I wonder if those quote unquote negative experiences that they had was because and I did a podcast episode with the gentleman Kurt Ellenberger, who's a professor of music and jazz,
Mhm.
and one thing that he said was that our brains automatically can detect what's right or wrong about music,
Mhm.
and,
Mhm.
like, if you like, we subconsciously can just fill in a musical note,
Yeah.
it just is intuitive. I'm curious that if the kids are given a backdrop of music that makes sense, and they're given these 5 keys that could all be, played within that, with their brains are detecting like, while they're improvising or while they're just messing around or tinkering, hey, that didn't belong where it was supposed to go, and so it's
So
picking up on that.
yeah, well, so the whole thing is it shouldn't pick up that, right? Like the whole point of us giving the music and the backdrop we gave them is so that it will never sound bad. As long as you play the notes we gave you, it'll sound good. So actually, if
There
you're
is no
okay with
wrong
it,
note, you mean?
yeah, so there is no
Okay.
wrong note. It's not pause. Like I can even send you the files later to listen
Mhm.
to, but it's like there's no wrong note. Like if you play the five black notes and we get
Yeah.
put all five black note harmonies, there's literally no mistake you can make. If you
Ooh,
just played the
cool.
same note over and over again, it would sound good. It
Do you
will
think it's their
sound
self-expectations then?
it
Maybe of,
could
like,
be.
what they would be expecting the next like, I know that when I'm oodling on my guitar
Yeah,
or where I start to play, like, a little riff,
yeah,
and I don't know my guitar fretboard well enough to know where that next sound that I wanna make will come from, right? I
yeah,
have a general idea,
yeah,
lower down is a little higher and higher up
yeah,
is a little deeper, but I don't really know, and so, like, I'm noodling and I'm playing, and then I
yeah,
hear, like, a ding, dah, and "Oh,
yeah,
shoot, that was totally wrong." I was
yeah,
expecting something else,
yeah.
and I didn't know where to find it, and so like you're saying that that it's objectively can't be wrong, but I'm curious if they're trying to follow their own kind of pattern maybe,
It's
and maybe
entirely
not letting
possible.
themselves down in that kind of sense.
Yeah, so while they literally can't make a mistake, that doesn't mean they don't have their own anxiety about trying to
Right,
figure out
right.
which note should go next, right? Like, so I've done this myself too, and I'm a pianist, and I'm used to using my 5 notes, and I'm like, "I don't know which one I'm gonna move." So there is a little bit of it's like, which finger should I move next, and
Yeah.
what happens, and then what do I do if I don't know what to do after that note? So there is that little bit of a thought process, at least even for me. So it's
Mhm.
entirely possible that while they couldn't make a mistake, that doesn't mean they didn't have some anxiety about trying to figure out what they should do next, you know? And that might have been why there was a little bit of negative
Or
valence.
even expectations of what they want
Yeah,
the next sound to sound like, and then maybe
yeah,
they weren't meeting that.
yeah, it's like, I know what I want it to sound like, but I'm such a beginner. Oh, I hit something that wasn't what I wanted, you know? Entirely possible. And, I didn't really do interviews or anything to figure out what they were feeling when they were doing this, but that would also be something that, yeah, we could get
Yeah,
more at,
and
like, were you
because
like, they didn't say they were scared. Everyone thought it was really cool to be in this
mhm.
experiment. They felt like they were helping science, no one was scared per se, but I didn't ask them, "Well, what was it like when you were improvising versus playing?"
Sure.
I didn't get into that level detail, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, because some and a key theme for a lot and I had to learn this really because I thought I was going crazy, was that with a lot of great improv bands is that not every time that they play is gonna
Yeah.
sound good.
Yeah, no,
And
they have bad days, it's
yeah, and so I'm
interesting.
like, "I don't know
Of
why I don't like
course.
this song," and everyone's like, "Dude, that song sucks. Of course you don't like it. They didn't play well that night." I'm like, "Oh, I thought I was nuts the whole
No,
time, you know? I
I
didn't
mean,
realize."
you have to look at everyone's output. We always used to joke in conservatory, even Beethoven had to learn how to be Beethoven. His early Beethoven doesn't sound like his, Ode to Joy, like Ninth Symphony, right? Like,
Mhm.
we have everyone who's a musician goes through their own period of development. If you're a performer, some days are good, some days are bad. In fact, another thing that I'm doing with the NEA Research Lab is I'm interviewing these NEA jazz masters. So it's the highest award our country gives towards jazz musicians. So we're talking about really amazing. And I asked them about their creative process. And I
Mhm.
asked them, hey, do you still have bad days? Do you ever have performance anxiety still? And many of them are like, you know what? I'm too old. I don't have that kind of performance anxiety anymore. But of course, they say some days are bad. Some days
Yeah.
you're just not going to play as well as other days. And when everything aligns nicely, that's an amazing performance. But you can't always control that, just like I'm sure you have days it's like going to the gym or teaching, right? Some days feel like it's going really nicely, flows easily, you feel like on top of your work, and other days not so much.
Yep,
Right?
yep,
So
yep.
I think that happens even to great musicians too, it's just that we don't always see their worst days. And here's the thing too, let's say you are Coltrane, even your bad day probably sounds pretty good,
Yeah.
compared to what it could be. So I think that that's something I've learned too, is that expert artists also know how to how to do things in a way that make it work towards their favor, right? Like I said, if they did have a bad day and they're making a ton of mistakes, maybe they just keep using those mistakes, and so you don't even notice it was a mistake. You notice
Mhm.
something's a little off, but they used it, in an impressive enough way that other
Mhm.
people wouldn't notice. Or I used to do ballet when I was in high school, and I would notice the really senior dancers, they could fall, make falling look really graceful, right? So
Mhm.
I think it's not so much that they don't have bad days, that people don't fall. It's that they know how to recover, and get back up and use it somehow and recover quickly. I mean, when I played piano, I would make mistakes all the time. My I guess the thing that would always make ruin my performances, I would have memory slips. Like all of a
Mhm.
sudden I'm playing and I forget what I'm supposed to do. But the older I got and realizing it was going to happen, I just learned to recover really quickly. So if you don't know the music as well as I do, you wouldn't know that I had had a memory slip, but I know that wasn't a good performance, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
I think that's the difference between domain expertise. Like, okay, that wasn't great, but I covered well enough. Whereas a kid's like, I don't even know if what I'm hitting next is going to be what I think it is. So that's a very different kind of
Yeah.
artistic experience.
Really cool, and it's super different, I'm sure, as far as psychology and
Yeah.
their brain development goes too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think artists will if you think about artists now as adults, they're expressing their own artistic voice, right? You can't help but have a lived experience and inject your own experience and your culture and your artistic voice into your expression. But kids don't have that level of domain. They don't have years and years of experience. They're just doing it in a very raw, unfiltered way that's different from what adults do.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really, really awesome. I love that you're doing this research, and I love that I love that it's, that because this is something that could really go this could be something that could really change education and
Yes.
development and the way that we even perceive what learning is and what self-expression is, and I think it's
Yeah.
really, really crucial to be able to do this kind of research and really be scientific and fun and serious about it in the same
Yeah.
t in the same breath,
Yeah. Well,
and still do this.
yeah, I think something we have felt as scientists is obviously I'm preaching to the choir. I believe the arts are amazing in and by
Mhm.
themselves, right? But as a teacher in public school systems, the arts are being defunded in many education systems across the country. And I think what we hope is that by having all this rigorous scientific research, we show why the arts are important and
Yes.
how they can be leveraged to help us, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think if all of us could figure out a way to be more creative, wouldn't that be great? That's good for
Yeah.
humanity. I mean, if you think about creativity being the bedrock of innovation and, development and things like that, then
Mhm.
everyone wants to be more creative, whether you're a Fortune 500 company or teachers or, musicians, everyone wants to be more creative. So we think that this science is trying to support that. But moreover, showing like, okay, well, when you are being creative, it's a very unique brain pattern. It's good for you to do these things. Be doing creative artistic tasks is good for the longevity of your brain, and that
Mhm.
you will continue to develop if you keep doing these things versus, slipping into cognitive and neurodegenerative decline, right? Like it's one way that we could maybe combat some of the normal things that would happen. So I think many of us hope that this science helps with advocacy, that it helps show how important the arts are by themselves, but also because of what they can do for us.
Yep, then we gotta keep on having these type of conversations.
I
That's
know,
what we gotta keep on
exactly.
doing.
I
And
know, I
and
know.
with I wanna kinda end our, this has been so much fun. I wanna end our conversation talking about, a topic you just brought up, aging, longevity,
Mhm.
and specifically, I am curious too, and I don't know if you do any of this. I wanna talk about dementia for sure. Have you
Yeah.
done any kind of research as far as stroke victims go? Because,
I
I know
myself have
yeah.
not, but I can tell you about some of the literature, but go ahead
Sure,
first
yeah,
after.
because what I was gonna so I know, for example, Jerry Garcia famously had a stroke, and I had to relearn pretty much guitar from scratch, and, and what happens and how that works. I know that my grandfather, my mom's father, before he passed away, had a stroke, and obviously that affects our ability to speak and
Mhm.
the we know that it does something to a good chunk of our brain.
Yep. Yep.
Uh, what do we know about music? Is there a difference in consuming versus playing as far as aging
Yeah.
goes? And what does some of that look like, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so let's start with the stroke and traumatic brain injury. I
Mhm,
think so the systematic reviews do show that using music therapy. So music therapy is when you have do music in the context of a therapeutic relationship with like a board certified music therapist. So you have
mhm,
like goals, much like you would as if you went to a talk therapist, right?
mhm.
So what they find is that music therapy really does help with traumatic brain injury. So like with if you're recovering from stroke, you may gain your limb use better or things like
Wow.
that. So there's a lot so music therapy is very powerful for brain injury. Now what we see too is actually music therapy the most robust and rigorous research that we've seen is in older adults. So we've seen that music can really help with things like Parkinson's disease because music has a beat. So let's say you have Parkinson's disease and you're struggling just to get walking, to find this inner beat to start walking. When you play music and you work with a music therapist, it helps you get back into that so that you can maybe start walking by yourself. And what we see with dementia is there's an amazing movie, if people haven't seen it, it's called Alive Inside. It used to be on Netflix, it's probably on Prime now, but basically it was a nonprofit organization that was doing what was called the iPod project. And they brought little iPods to nursing homes and older adults and let them listen to whatever music they wanted. And,
Mhm.
these were dementia patients who were very inert, maybe not moving, maybe not always remembering their old family, couldn't speak that well. And all of a sudden, when you play them the music they like, they become alive again, right?
Yeah.
They're articulate and they have opinions and they're alert and engaging. And so we see that music is really amazing for dementia. In fact, for a lot of people with dementia, specifically among Alzheimer's disease, memory for music is actually pretty well preserved. And
Wow.
so what you can take advantage of that, right? And use music to bring people into themselves and help them remember things. Now,
Mhm.
we still don't know why it works, like what is the mechanism that music helps people with Alzheimer's disease, but there's a theory. The theory is that in dementia, if you think about it, parts of the brain are kind of going offline and they're starting to become isolated, like little islands. Like your brain's not talking to each other, but music brings it all back together into
Right.
synchrony, right? So that's a working hypothesis, a working theory. More research is being done. But yeah, there's actually some research, people are trying to figure out like, okay, can music, along with dementia, there are a lot of what we call behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. So let's say depression, anxiety, agitation, lethargy,
Mhm.
right? We're starting to try to very systematically be like, okay, when can we use music and how does it help with agitation or lethargy or depression or anxiety, right?
Right.
We're kind of at that stage being like, imagine if eventually we could prescribe music the way we would prescribe an
Yeah.
antidepressant, right? Be like, okay, I want you to go and I want you to do your choir 3 times a week, 30 minutes, and we're going to see, and see how that affects your behavior and these, what we call behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. So there's a lot of work that's being done on it. In fact, that's why 2 of my grants are actually, I recently got an NIA from the NIH. I got a KO1.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a career development grant to study the use of improv-based music therapy to help
Nice.
people with dementia and their care partners. I wanna look at, like, does it help because
Yeah,
care
yeah, yeah, as a
partners
unit.
yeah, as a
Oh,
unit,
man.
caregivers have a lot of burden when you're taking care of someone who's sick, right? So
Yeah.
can we use improv-based music therapy to reduce stress, reduce depression,
I'll
reduce
introduce you to my
anxiety?
grandparents. I would love to
Yes,
I'd
I
love
mean,
you to
yeah,
I'd
I
love
mean,
to
and
hear
I
that.
think yeah, and I think one of the benefits of doing something like this is it's non-pharmacological, right? Like, I
Mhm.
could people obviously, there is medication to help things, but if you think about it, medication can often have side effects, right? Whereas if you pick the right music, you're working with board-certified music therapists, there's not likely to be adverse events, and so it's like a good frontline first
Right, low
approach.
risk.
Low risk, a good way to try starting to help someone who's dealing with
Mhm.
dementia. And granted, again, this is for early dementia. We're not talking about late stage dementia yet, but this is where, that's one of the research areas that I'm looking into, that I'm
Wow.
starting. I'm at the beginning
So
of it.
it's so amazing. It's so cool. I mentioned to you that, that I think I mentioned to you that I used to visit the assisted living homes
Mhm,
back when I was in college, and one of the things I used to do was I used to just sing,
mhm.
and people that and people and the residents in these homes, um, it doesn't even make a difference. It was so it almost felt and obviously I'm sure it wasn't, but it almost felt unanimous as far as anecdotally everyone remembers the Frank Sinatra songs that we would sing.
Yeah,
Everyone remember the
yeah,
classic show tunes that we would sing, and
yeah,
it would and what I would imagine is this also brings back a whole bunch of series
yeah,
of associations and memories that the
exactly. Like
music
a
helped draw back,
yeah,
and I know, for example, that I have a very strong association with James Taylor. That,
mhm,
like, I took my wife and I had gone to, his concert in Tanglewood,
yeah,
the drive there and the music, but, even being introduced to his music in
mhm,
college, I
yep,
have very, very strong and so
yep,
I play music in parts of myself that I haven't even thought about in years just
yep,
come rushing to the fore.
mhm,
Chicago,
yeah,
"You're the Inspiration" was my breakup song in high school, and I
yeah.
didn't listen to it in, like, a decade, and it came on the radio, and I just was transported back, and I thought about the girl that a girl that I hadn't thought about
Thought about for
in
years,
15,
right?
20 years, and, like, all
Right.
these memories and so I'm sure that that has a lot to do with it. It's really, really incredible.
Absolutely. I mean, they call this a music cognition. We joke the phenomena is like they're playing our song. So think
Mhm.
about it. Let's say you're 80, 90 years old, but you remember the song you danced to at your wedding, right? It
Yeah.
brings you back right there. And that's the thing. Music has an amazing way to pull on all these associations. And, something else we're trying to start doing, again, we're still trying to find funding. So we haven't done it much yet, but we're trying to bring personalized playlists to older adults who are treated in the emergency room, right? So
Yeah.
the emergency room is a really stressful place, enough so that many older adults will feel delirious. They'll get confused. They don't know where
Yeah.
they are, or they'll just get angry and start getting agitated. And right, like normally maybe you would have to use medication to calm them down, but if we give them a
Uh-huh, sure.
Spotify with their headphones, we often do like, what do you want to listen to? And anecdotally we joke, okay, well, take when they were born and add 18 to 25 years because we all remember the music of our youth, right? And
Sure.
so if you do that, like it's a Frank Sinatra, it's like if you add the songs of their youth, it often does calm them down. Or at least it takes a very stressful medical situation like the emergency room and makes
Mhm.
it so they can function again and remember who they are, right? So this is all work that's being done right now. It's all ongoing, still being studied, but I do think so. I think that's why that music has music isn't the only domain. Scent is also one of those that has a very
Yeah.
strong association, but music has a very strong association with memory. And like I said, specifically in Alzheimer's disease, it's amazing that they might forget their name, they might forget their family members, they don't know why they're here, but they hear that song and they're like, "Oh, I went to prom on that was the song at prom," or "I danced to that at my wedding, and I went to see
Mhm.
that show. The tickets were really expensive," but right, it brings back all this what we call autobiographical memory. Like if you think
Yeah.
about it as, everyone in our life, we all have these soundtracks that accompany our lives, right? The soundtrack of our own
Uh-huh.
personal life, right? And so when you play that back when you're 80 or 90, it brings you back into these autobiographical memories.
Is there research on the impacts of someone with dementia or some kind of neurodegenerative disease playing as opposed to consuming music?
We're still looking at that right now. So in music therapy, they considered listening to music as something known as receptive music therapy compared
Uh-huh.
to playing an instrument that's active music therapy. So, we're trying both. I think there's benefits to both, likely higher benefits to actually playing because it's again a
Mhm.
more complex process. But that's something, for example, my KO1 will do because they're going to be playing marimbas. And then I also am a co-investigator on an R61 with Dr. Julian Johnson here at UCSF, where we're teaching older adults with mild cognitive impairment, that's like the preclinical stage to Alzheimer. It's like what directly precedes Alzheimer's disease. And we're offering them improv lessons, piano improv lessons. And we're trying to see
Nice.
how does this affect it? Again, all in progress right now. So I can't speak too much to the findings since we're still gathering the data, but that is the type of research we are doing right now.
That's so exciting. That means I have to be in touch about
Yeah, absolutely. Follow up.
like, when you while you keep on doing all this research, because this is all awesome stuff. I love
Well,
all this
thank
stuff.
you.
What are Yeah.
It's like science is not an easy path by any way, by any means, particularly now in this funding climate. But it's really nice to get to talk to people and realize that, most people care about this because, I mean, something to think about too is that we know from music cognition is that literally every culture on this planet has had music. The
Mhm.
oldest instruments are from 40,000 years ago and they predate visual art. They come before the caves of Lascaux and things like
Yeah.
that. So it's amazing. I'm just like, well, that really speaks to the importance of music for human society, right? And so I think whenever I talk about this research, while it can be hard when I'm in the throes of writing a grant or a manuscript, music is something that's very accessible to pretty much all of us, many of us, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd be curious, one thing that I've noticed recently as I've kind of been exploring more music is, speaking of ancient or older types of music, is that so there's some genres like bluegrass or, some types of, I guess, maybe Irish or traditional music that don't have such heavy emphasis on the rhythm section, or any kind of, percussion in particular, and it's much more of a string sound, and they kind of depend on a bass or some kind of other
Mhm,
heavy instrument to create that sense of rhythm. But I think but I always felt, at least, again, anecdotally, that the percussion was almost like the heartbeat, like the
mhm,
really, really, like, core
mhm.
primal aspect of the music that just
Yeah,
kind of sweeps people up almost as much as anything else. It's almost like the whole, like, backdrop, and then everything else is kinda just flares and colors coming from that.
yeah.
And it was curious to see, the difference between, I love Springsteen's drummer, Max Weinberg, and yeah, and the way that he drums in particular really feels, 'cause Springsteen was known for changing the tempo a lot, even mid-song, so
Wow, yep,
boom,
so
boom,
everyone has
boom,
to
boom, stop.
adjust.
Yeah, exactly, and, you're like, "What do I do? What
You
do I,"
do.
especially when you're jogging and you feel
Mhm.
like, like, and it gets you
Yeah.
that into that place of that runner's high, but then you listen to Billy Strings Band and you're like, there is no percussion, and they somehow still find a way to keep that going, and how does that work? All that stuff
Well,
to me is
so
awesome.
in that, there in the Billy Stream example, it's implied beats. So even though there's not a percussion there, they're setting the
Mhm.
from a music theory standpoint, they're setting
Yeah.
the meter strongly enough that you feel it, so it's implied.
Cool.
But yes, is the percussion often a grounding thing? Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, in improv music therapy, the music therapist often will play a lower xylophone to set the beat, and that's grounding. It's to help set a foundation, and everyone else layers on top of it. And it's very much tied to physiology. Something music cognition people have found is that the tempos we tend to like, so the tempos that music fall in, tend to be the same physiological tempos as our heart rate and our breath rate, right? Like,
Wow.
and if you think music is human created, right? We have created tempos that mimic our own physiological rates. So, yes, absolutely, you're probably running, right, to a certain beat per minute and then it changes and it does mess with your physiology, right? So,
Uh-huh.
yes, that music is this is again this idea that music is very tied to culture and biology and things like that. And those are the type of things that music cognition and trying to understand.
Awesome. And my last question for you, which I like to end now on every podcast on now, is what are you excited and hopeful for as far as your research in the future and
Yeah.
anything else?
I really hope that I can continue to keep doing research on music. Music work or arts-based work has always been really kind of underfunded and undervalued, right? Certainly, it's
Mhm.
not cancer research, absolutely not. But, I do think it's really important, and I think they're seeing that the public is starting to know more and more about using the arts and music. So what I'm really hopeful for is that I really hope more people start to see why the arts are valuable, but then also help advocate for funding sources and, philanthropy that does support work like this on the arts, because up until now, I think I've always considered what I do very niche, and I am still considered niche, particularly even at like a medical school like UCSF. So I'm very hopeful though that in the future people will continue to see how important the arts are and fund work like this. And then I hope that kind of work will eventually help artists, right? We have all these artists graduating from school and showing that they can have careers that are not just being in the arts. Maybe you become an arts therapist or a music practitioner or things like that, using your talent and your skills for health or for, aging or working in community homes. So that's what I'm hopeful for. That's like my pipe dream is eventually we get to that point.
I love that. And just to I think, I was talking again to Dr. Kurt Ellenbogen about this, but, he said that there's a real disconnect between the research world of music and the university type of
Yeah,
world and academia and the actual performance world. And he said
yeah,
there's a real gap between them that needs that he thinks should be bridged. And I would love to encourage that. I would love to,
yeah,
for great musicians to wanna go to universities and wanna go to you
yeah,
guys and wanna go and say, "Hey, how can we work together and understand this and wo and provide mutual beneficial research for everyone." And I think that I
yeah.
think I would love that. That's something I really hopeful for, and I would love for that to happen.
Yeah, and I've been really lucky with my National Endowment for the Arts funds. I've been very lucky that musicians have been buying in, that we've been able to get Esperanza
Nice.
Spalding and Colin Mochrie and Zakir Hussain and these amazing greats to come in because they do think it's important. But yeah, this work doesn't happen unless musicians and artists buy in and help us support it. And I think something that I have personally found as a scientist, it really helps that I do have this music background because I can go into conservatories and say, no, I'm not just some weird neuroscientist that want to study your brain. I'm
Mm,
one of you. This is what's gonna happen. Like, I can speak. They take me seriously because I have music training, right? Or
sure.
arts training. So I do think I'm hopeful that there's gonna be more and more of this interdisciplinary work and that it's gonna be more and more public so that people realize how important it is. But yeah, I mean, I think we all know it. Like we all have aging parents or grandparents and want to use what we can. And so I think these are the more we bring this into our real lives, I think the better. So I'm hopeful for that too.
Dr. Karen Barrett, thank you so much for coming
You're
on.
so
This was so much
welcome.
fun. This was such a blast. I really appreciate your time, and this
Of
was and
course.
I can't wait. I hope to do this again. This was a really ton of fun.
Yeah, this was so much fun. I was like, I didn't know which studies we'd be talking about. I love that it just was like a conversation that we got to have, and it's great. And it did seem very like we were able to flow from topic to topic very cohesively. So good job. Thank you, Ephraim. I
Of
appreciate
course,
it.
this is a ton of fun. Have a great
Yeah,
day.
you
Thank you.
too. So let me know if you need anything else.